So bollworms used to be a very, very damaging pest to cotton in Arkansas. And really, since recently, we've been introduced with these transgenic varieties such as Bollgard 3 cotton or Wide Strike 3 cotton that contains the VIP gene. Does a really good job of controlling our bollworm pest in this cotton. However, every once in a while, resistance will develop to these genes, and we really have to start paying a lot closer attention to bollworm injury out in this cotton. As it stands right now, our bollworm threshold is 5% damaged fruit, and then it's 2 to 3 worms per 14 row feet of checked row. So termination timing on cotton bollworm is 350 heat units past cutout. So you remember it's 250 heat units for tarnished plant bug. Well, it's actually 350 for bollworms. And it's because they can actually eat through those bolls that are a little bit harder than what tarnished plant bug can get through. And so that's why you got to check for a little bit longer time than you do on tarnished plant bug. So 350 heat units, kind of towards the end of the year, like we've been collecting about 180 heat units this year in August per week. And so that would equate to about 2 weeks that you're going to have to check the cotton past cutout for bollworm before you can terminate those applications. So traditionally, we've had a 20% egg lay threshold. So if you could find 20% of the plants out there, if you could find a bollworm egg on them, then that would mean you need to treat for bollworm. As it stands right now, because our 3 gene technology, so our Wide Strike 3, Twin Link Plus, Bollgard 3 cottons actually provide protection from the worm, we don't spray on a 20% egg lay threshold anymore, because we know once those eggs hatch out, they'll feed on the plant and they'll cause minimal injury with their feeding before that worm ends up dying. So on 3 gene cotton, we do not recommend spraying on a 20% egg lay. However, if you were checking non-BT cotton or Bollgard 2 cotton or Wide Strike cotton, one of the 2 gene varieties that does not contain the VIP gene, you would actually be able to treat on a 20% egg lay, because we know that a large portion of those worms are going to survive because those BTs are not controlling the bollworm in those plants anymore. So as I mentioned before, we're looking for eggs on some of this cotton. And this is particularly important if you're looking at non-BT cotton or Bollgard 2 cotton. As it stands right now, 3 gene cotton varieties, ones that contain the VIP gene, do a good job of controlling bollworms. So we know that once this egg hatches out on a 3 gene cotton variety, it's going to feed on the cotton plant and it will end up dying. And so it doesn't actually need to be treated for, because the plant incorporated protectant is actually going to end up controlling that bollworm once it hatches out. If this is a cotton variety that, as I mentioned before, like non-BT or Bollgard 2, or even if eventually in the future the VIP gene starts not performing as well on our Bollgard cotton, we're going to go back to scouting for eggs. And eggs are really important to scout for, because once that bollworm hatches out, they pretty rapidly will bore into a square or bore into a bowl and get to an area where they cannot be killed with an insecticide. So once they get inside that bowl, they get extremely hard to kill, because they don't move a whole lot out of that, and you can't get insecticide inside that bowl. So if you're working with cotton that doesn't have a gene in it that is actually going to control the bollworms that are laying eggs on it, you're really going to want to pay attention to these eggs. So as I mentioned previously, scouting for eggs is very important whenever you're dealing with a cotton technology that will not control bollworms. So this could be non-BT cotton, this could be Bollgard 2 cotton, Wide Strike 2, or regular old Wide Strike cotton. If you're on 3 gene cotton, such as Wide Strike 3, Bollgard 3, Twin Link Plus cotton, as of right now, these technologies are controlling bollworms. And so I know that this egg, whenever it hatches out, it'll feed on the plant and that worm will eventually die. If it's on non-BT cotton or Bollgard 2 cotton, Wide Strike cotton, that worm has a pretty good chance of hatching out and actually surviving. And once that bollworm gets inside a square or gets inside a bowl, they're nearly impossible to kill with an insecticide because they're protected from any insecticide that you put out there on the plant. So killing that worm before it has a chance to get into a protected area is very important on those technologies that do not control the bollworms. A common method of scouting for eggs out in cotton is to pull stuck dried bloom tags as you're walking through the field. And commonly guys will walk down the row, they'll collect a handful of bloom tags as they're walking out of the field after they conducted their plant bug scouting or whatever other pests that they're looking for out there. And they'll take them back to the truck to where it's actually cool and you can sit in there and you can just look through these bloom tags as you're sitting there in the cool weather. And I say in the cool weather, in the cool truck, and you can go through these bloom tags looking for eggs. And so let's say for instance you have 100 bloom tags, just to make the math easy. If you look through there and you find that 20% of them have an egg on there, that's a 20% egg lay. And that would mean that, again, if you're in a field that doesn't have a technology that's going to control bollworms, that you would need to treat in that instance. Here's some eggs right here. And you can see that these eggs are pretty pearly white. That means they're pretty freshly laid. They'll get a little darker in color as they get a little older, and it takes about 3 days before they hatch. So our threshold's based off of scouting 14 row feet and doing whole plant searches along those 14 row feet, looking for worms, looking for eggs. I will say that a lot of people will check just 25 blooms, 25 squares, 25 bowls within an area, and they'll do that across the field until they get to 100. And then you can easily, from that, you can go, okay, well, if I've got 5 damaged bowls, or 5, it's really 5 damaged fruiting structures. So if you have 5 damaged squares, or 5 damaged bowls, or 5 damaged blooms, or any combination of those, leading up to 5 out of 100, that's 5% injury. And that's treatment threshold, all right? So why do we go to 14 row feet? Why is it not based off of 10 row feet? Why is it based off 14? Well, there's 13,756 row feet in a 38-inch row in an acre of cotton. And so that gives us roughly 1,000th of an acre that we sampled for bollworms. So generally, I kind of like to start at the top of the plant, and I'll go through and I'll start looking at these blooms, looking in here to see if I see any damage, checking the bowls as I go down. One thing that you can really end up keying on is if you do see a little bit of damage up here in the top of the plant, you can follow that worm trail down the plant. So sometimes you'll see a little bit of thrash, you may see a little bitty square fed upon, and so you'll be able to actually track him farther down the plant. As he gets a little larger, they tend to move farther down. And so sometimes you can end up finding that worm if you do see a little damage up in the top of the plant. So this is an example of a damaged boll. And it's not very obvious. Whenever this boll was together like this, an egg was laid on that bloom, and then the caterpillar hatched out and it bored through the bottom of that bowl or the bottom of that flower down into the bowl, and then from there it was protected. And you can see what the inside of that bowl looks like. So that caterpillar fed inside that bowl and then caused all that injury. Here's an example of a worm in a bowl. And this is in a bloom. This is an example of a pretty large worm. In a bloom. Now that caterpillar has obviously been in this cotton for a while and eaten. So something I do want to mention is that this is non-BT cotton that we use for research purposes. It's not very common for guys to plant non-BT cotton in Arkansas. So that's the reason that we can actually find quite a few injured bolls or blooms, injured fruiting structures out here in this cotton. So this is an example why you want to pull stuck dried bloom tags off the top of a bowl whenever you're scouting for worms. A lot of eggs get laid on these blooms like this. And so what happens is that once that egg hatches out, that bloom dries up and that caterpillar bores right down into the top of that bowl. And you can see where that caterpillar bored in the top of that bowl when that bloom tag was still on the top. And really the whole time, that's really important reason why eggs need to be sprayed if you're in a non-BT or a Bollworm 2 variety, is because once that caterpillar gets down in that bloom, it hatches out, that bloom closes up around it, and then it bores straight from that bloom down into the bowl to where it ends up causing injury. And you can see where that caterpillar started boring into the top of that bowl. It doesn't look like he made it too far in this case though. So one thing to be very cognizant of is to pay attention to the size of the worms. So we have a threshold whenever we talk about 2 to 3 worms per 14 row feet. We're really talking about worms that are longer than 1/4 inch long. We know that worms, once they hatch out, they're very, very tiny and a lot of times hard to see. But if those worms hatch out and they're on a BT technology, many times those worms will feed and then they'll die. But we know once they get to 1/4 inch or longer, those worms have a lot greater likelihood of surviving on that BT technology cotton. And so that's why you got to pay attention to your worm sizes. So 2 to 3 bollworms that are longer than 1/4 inch long is threshold in a technology that is no longer providing control of bollworms. So this is a bollworm larvae that is really right at 1/4 inch. If I found that worm in a 3-gene technology, I would say he probably already fed. Usually they die before they reach that stage if it's in cotton that is Bollworm 3, or 3-gene I should say. All right, so this is an example of a damaged square. You can see the caterpillar crawling around on it pretty obviously, but you see there's a tiny little hole. Actually, that one's not that tiny. Actually, you can see a hole where it bored into that square, so it's pretty obvious that that one has been fed on by a worm. Here's an example of a little bit older boll damage. You can see where the caterpillar fed on it and it actually made a hole in it. A lot of times when I'm looking to see if a boll has been injured or not, sometimes you'll see etching around the top of that, around the top of the bowl or somewhere on the bowl, but sometimes it's not real obvious whether that caterpillar was able to penetrate the bowl and impact its integrity. So one thing I'll do a lot of times is you can actually just squeeze that bowl or square, and you can see if anything comes out of it, if any frass comes out of it, or really just anything that's inside that bowl. And you can see when I peel that one open, it's obviously been damaged on the inside, and so that one is counted as a damaged bowl.